Happy New Year to myself. It's 2017. Wasn't sure if I'd make it. I remember before my birthday, I was in the psych ward and I was turning 34 and I wasn't sure if I was going to make it past 33. I was really afraid. So made it through the year, and I'm in this tiny little room just because I can hear the TV noise through the floor in the living room. And I was in here anyway. I was looking for some information. And this morning I did TRE, trauma releasing exercise, by Dr. Briselli. I think it's the 4th or 5th time I've done it. I'm going to try and do it every other day or every few days. And it's also day 4 of taking EMP. I did take it this morning, and I didn't get any of that white stuff on my hands, but I was feeling pretty happy for a while. Now I feel alright. I was jumping on my mini trampoline and I felt like I could jump on it all day. And then I shoveled some snow. I was looking through some of my binders of information from when I was doing all that research in the last couple of years, and I came across this paper that I have notes on from when I spoke with Victoria Maxwell, who is a mental health speaker and advocate and consultant. And I spoke with her on the phone, and we were talking about mental health, and she gave me this piece of advice, and it says, first priority, don't do anything to jeopardize your own mental health and own physical well-being, even when you're wanting to be of service. And she said this is an important guidepost. And I found it interesting just because I feel like I know that working in mental health isn't good for my mental health. Yet I'm still working in it, but I know I'm going to change that soon. It was a good reminder for myself though, because I probably spoke with her over 2 years ago. And I have a note about Itrogenic Illness, and I didn't know what that meant, so I looked it up, and it's something about the illness being caused by the treatment. And I resonate with that in terms of how I was treated in the psych ward in April of last year. Now I can say of last year. And I also came across this sheet that I got when I saw this lady who does live blood cell analysis. I've seen her twice over the years, and she's always right on with what to do. And she even wrote, take EM Power 12 a day for 2 weeks. And I'm actually seeing her on Wednesday. So I'm going to bring this and talk to her and see if she thinks I should do that, or if I should just take a little bit like I'm taking, or what I should do. And I found this paper I printed out on pyrole disorder. It's on pyrole, urea, that's hard to say, and Candida. And I pulled it out of the binder just because I think pyrole disorder is about something to do with hemoglobin. And right now I'm actually quite interested in this whole oxygenation thing, and blood flow and oxygen getting to the brain and blood flow through the capillaries and things. And it's interesting that pyrole disorder often needs a lot more zinc and B6 to help fix the problem. It almost seems like our blood cells aren't even being metabolized properly. It says pyrole, a key component of heme, as in hemoglobin, is overproduced in the liver. The severity of this condition fluctuates widely as it's strongly related to stress. And it seems like, why would the liver overproduce a component of heme? Maybe it's trying to produce more blood cells because the ones we have aren't properly going through the capillaries or something. Like maybe it's trying to change the structure of the blood cell. I actually feel it's hard to really explain what I'm thinking about in terms of this, but it's sort of like, I think the brain is desperate for oxygen and nutrients. It's starved. And it could be that this is a different type of blood cell hoping to get to the other regions of the brain, or there's so many different possibilities. But I'm just seeing this theme right now because I guess that's what I'm looking for around blood flow, even earthing and sunlight, and how that gets the blood flowing, I think. It says pyrole, a key component of heme, is overproduced in the liver and bone marrow. The surplus of pyrole binds to vitamin B6 and zinc and is excreted in the feces and urine. So this creates deficiencies in zinc and B6. And to me, that sounds like a bit of a desperate attempt to create more blood cells in a way. Like the body is creating more pyrole, hoping to create more blood cells perhaps. But when it's not happening, then it has to be excreted, and then it's wasting the B6 and the zinc. And it's saying that a big cause of the pyrole disorder is Candida overgrowth. And it's saying pyrole disorder is a main cause of mental emotional disorders. Yeah, that's a really interesting paper. If you Google pyrole, urea, and Candida. I might at some point go back to a ketogenic diet. If not, maybe do 1 day of fasting per week, because that helps to restore the mitochondrial function. And Dr. Mercola is coming out with a book on this soon, and I'll probably get that book just because I know he's been researching it really intensely. And I found another presentation I saw, and somebody was talking about how niacin decreases dopamine activity. I'm not really sure how that plays in, but it's interesting because I talk about dopamine, and I actually feel like there's this overemphasis on dopamine in the brain, and that could be what eventually causes it to sort of short circuit. Because you can think about, well, you need to use it or you'll lose it. And if you overuse it, you'll also lose it, because if we're always working out one muscle and we overuse it, we're actually going to disrupt the balance of the whole system. So it's not about just using it, it's about intelligently using it. We need to use other faculties of our brain too, besides pleasure, pain. So it's interesting that people have this area of their brain sort of short circuit, and then we need a lot more niacin in order to suppress the dopamine. And I found this other bit of information I printed by Captain Randall. I don't know who this guy is, but it was really interesting to me when I read it. This was in June of 2015 that I printed it. And he's talking in this paper, and I haven't reread it yet, about oxygen deprived, energy starved areas of the body and how they turn into cancer or have opportunistic bugs and infections flourish in those areas because they don't have oxygen. And I think the similar thing is actually happening with supposed mental illness, is that the brain is being deprived of oxygen. And it's not necessarily being deprived of oxygen because oxygen isn't going to the brain, but it's that we're not using it in the right way. So we're not allowing it to grow by actually using it and learning. Yeah, so I will read this one again because he's talking about raising charge to facilitate oxygen delivery. He does say, together with vitamin C, oxygen therapies should be basic treatment for depression and mental problems. And the main thing I wanted to find was these True Hope studies that I knew I had. And these are just the abstracts. They're not the actual studies, but I might want to give it to my doctor and see if she's open to supporting me to come off my medication. I want to say, read these while I'm gone and see if she'll be supportive, because they talk so much about being person-centered and everything, but will they really be person-centered? And I also remember them talking about this study that they did where they had this maze for rats or something, and there was normal rats, and then there was rats they removed half their brain or something like that. And then they gave the rats that they removed half their brain EMP, and the rats with half removed brains and taking EMP did better than the normal rats. And they also talk about how the brain regrows with EM Power Plus. And I thought to look for that because of how now I'm sort of thinking about this whole bipolar transconscious map consciousness phenomenon as brain growth. And I was remembering that I was talking about how it's like a second brain growth before. I just remembered that today. I was like, oh, I was kind of talking about this. And now I'm coming across things that are talking about brain growth and brain plasticity. And I'm thinking about how this phenomenon seems to me like the brain is trying to grow again. I think it's almost like a desperate attempt for the brain to start learning and growing again, because it's caught in such a habitual pattern where it's not even really learning anything. It's just existing in a machine-like nature of conditioned reflexes. And that way of existing and being isn't actually the way the brain is designed to be. So if there's certain preconditions met, it seems like the universe comes in and starts to turn the brain back on to learning. And I don't think it's that mysterious, because our brains were learning to begin with. So it's just this programming got installed in our brains and stopped it from learning. And then it makes sense that that's not really real. So it's just a matter of that falseness losing its grip and falling away and collapsing to some extent for a short period of time, and then the learning process turns back on. And then when a person's learning, they're acting different ways, they're free from the prison of habit, and people think that they're mentally ill because of that. And the person gets really happy and excited and everything, because it is pretty exciting to be here on earth with a brain that is able to learn. Just like when we were children, we were pretty darn excited. Our brain was fully engaged in learning. And I just find it really interesting how they talk about neuroplasticity and how mental health would say, well, the brain is damaged, it's a biological brain disease. But they're showing that through neuroplasticity, we can change almost anything in the brain. So I don't really think, even if there is some kind of truth to that statement about it being some kind of pathology in the brain, science is going to say, well, we can easily change that. Maybe not super easily all the time. So this whole story about buying into being defective permanently can't last, I don't think. And I don't really want to be a part of that story, because it's due to collapse upon itself, and I want to help that collapse upon itself in my life, because I don't subscribe to that. And I think the brain really wants to learn, the brain is a learning and exploring device. And I listened to a TED Talk that was super fascinating. And it was by a lady named Sandra Bond Chapman. And it was called Flex Your Cortex. And she started with this example of how she met a boy and her tape recorder was broken. And the boy had been diagnosed with severe autism with some kind of label about how he couldn't learn and was very impaired. And nobody could fix her tape recorder, and she'd taken it to different places, and this boy just took it apart and put it back together and fixed it in the snap of a finger. And then she decided to study neuroscience because of that. And right away when I heard that at the beginning of the talk, I was like, ooh, I want to listen to this, because I find the autism spectrum fascinating because the brain's learning in a different way. And I think it's an adaptation of the human brain overall, evolutionarily, in order to continue learning, because that could be it, that words and our language has actually gotten to the point where it's preventing us from learning. We think intelligence is words, but that example she gave and my observations of it as well is showing that it's just a different line of intelligence. And I think it's actually necessary because, like I said, words are preventing us from learning now, because we're so stuck in our own opinions and judgments that we're not actually learning anything. And she talked about unlocking the immense potential of our brains. I think the universe and our brains are trying to unlock the immense potential of our brains. Our brains are trying to unlock the immense potential of our brains. So a brain can have this transconscious experience or process happen. And it's, I feel, reinitiating the learning process. And when that happens, it's confusing, because we're actually used to operating with a brain that's not really learning much at all. It's absorbing a little bit here and a little bit there, but it's not actually engaged in learning in the moment, moment by moment. So it is initiated back to moment by moment learning, which can be scary, which can be confusing. It's not something we're used to. We used to be that way as kids. And she said it takes 1 to 2 generations for scientific discoveries to catch on, and she said that is too long. And I agree, and I feel like if I work in mental health, I'll be participating in that slow 1 to 2 generation process. Whereas if I just work with myself, then it's going to be a lot faster. And then she shared 7 secrets of the brain. And the one that interested me the most was when she said her secret number 4 is big idea thinking. So she talked about taking in different bits of information, combining it with old knowledge, and coming up with new ways of thinking that she said would be higher levels of thinking, like synthesizing, extracting the essence of it, finding the meaning in terms of interpreting it, and using transformative communication as well. She said big idea thinking is what makes our thinking, memory, and learning most robust. And she said when we engage in big idea thinking, it actually increases blood flow to the neurons by 8 to 12%. And it also increases the speed of the connection of neurons in some areas of the brain by 30%. And how I relate this to my experience is that in mania, that's what it is. It's constant big idea thinking. It's seeing the more, it's extrapolating, it's interpreting, it's processing. And with the speed of how it happens, it makes sense that certain connections would be happening 30% faster. And I actually feel like there is an increase in blood flow to the brain in that process. And I think it's actually happening because the brain is attempting to learn again. And I feel that's what can happen when the ego collapses, is that all of a sudden one thinks in a different way because one thinks based on what one is perceiving. And she did a ton of studies and said that her studies show that big idea thinking increases your brain health at all levels. And then I was thinking about my process of self-dialogue and how a lot of it is just me synthesizing and interpreting things and making meaning out of things and adding things together to create higher levels and new ways of thinking, at least for myself. Maybe other people have thought these things too. And it's not about what it is I'm thinking exactly. It's not about anything in particular. It's not about the ideas and whether they're right or wrong, and I've said this before. It's about the process itself, the learning process. And if I think about mania and map consciousness and trans consciousness and how the brain is just really enjoying learning, by doing this process with myself, I'm actually engaged in that same thing, just to a smaller scale. I'm doing it consciously with myself versus waiting for the universe or whatever it is to switch that process on in my brain. And it was interesting that I came across this talk because I was thinking about how do I increase the oxygen to my brain and the blood flow to my brain. Do I invert? Do I hang upside down? Do I go outside and walk barefoot? Do I get more sunshine? And those are two things I plan to do when I go to California. Do I jump more on my mini trampoline, which is one thing I do, and I think that's something that probably helps with oxygenation of the body too. And then I came across this talk and she's saying one of the best things to do is actually think big. And when we think about the brain, that's what the brain is for. That is what exercises the brain, is to think in different ways and to see things in different ways. And I feel like map consciousness, since the ego collapses or gets scrambled temporarily, then all of a sudden the brain it's strange. It's strange. The last couple of days I've gone blank a few times. Just in the middle of my sentence. I have no, I feel like I know what I wanted to say or I was going to say, but it just stops. So she said, big idea thinking is brain exercise. So I'd like to think that mania is brain exercise. It's getting the brain to step outside its normal thought patterns. Because if we only are thinking a very small number of things, we're only seeing a very small number of things. And that's the thing the brain does in map consciousness, is it's able to take many different perspectives. Because when it sees something, it can take that perspective, it can see how it works, it can understand it. So then it has taken that perspective. So it's a process of, I think the brain wants us to be able to see more perspectives than just our individual goals and success and our individual desires and pleasures, because the world can't take that anymore. And that's one of the reasons why somebody who goes into map consciousness feels so altruistic or mystical or powerful, because I think one's connecting with that power that if we were all really cooperating together, we would be that powerful. It's not a power that one individual actually has, because we're not actually individuals. We're the same consciousness. At that level of consciousness, we're all the same, and we would work together, not for our own individual gratification, because we would see where that leads us. And she talks about the importance of innovating and new things, and I think that goes along with big idea thinking, is that everything feels new. And I think part of it too would be just seeing something in a new way. So one doesn't necessarily have to have this completely random and chaotic life. One can just be aware of seeing things in new ways, or suspending judgment. And then she talked about motivation too, and how important it is. And I feel like if our brain is restored to learning, we're actually motivated. And I think that's why society as a whole is sort of collectively depressed, because a lot of our brain, we're sort of told to live a certain way, and we're not really exercising our brains. We're not really thinking for ourselves. We're being told what to think, and we have these repetitive thoughts, so we're not able to think for ourselves. And this to me also, I think, reaffirms what I was talking about in terms of how the prefrontal cortex is shutting down in favor of probably blood flow to other areas. This yapping has to shut down in order for us to learn and think and see anew. We stopped learning when the prefrontal cortex yapping started, because we're hearing that, and that's getting in the way of actual learning. It's getting in the way of seeing, because we're actually only seeing our words. We're not seeing with the light of our consciousness. We're seeing images based on the stories that our own words are telling us. So we're not actually seeing what's in front of us. We have this projection superimposed over reality, and then we're not learning about reality as we go. We're projecting from the past. So we're all living in the past, and we're not actually learning. And how can we enjoy life when we're living in the past? So I think that was a really important video for me to watch at that moment, because it has large relevance to this self-dialogue, because I'm utilizing self-dialogue in a way to talk about the big ideas that I have about things, and it seems like, from what she's saying, that's going to exercise and grow my brain. And if my brain is wanting to grow, and one of the reasons why it goes into mania is in order to grow, even though it's kind of confusing, by talking about all of that and creating that context, is creating the brain cells of that context by talking about it, instead of having it this uncharted territory when I go into that state, if I get pushed into a super hyper learning state. And part of it too is that I think that super hyper learning state of mania actually does damage the prefrontal cortex, because one is so hypersensitive and hyperperceptive to this society that we've designed, that as we go through it, we're learning all these beautiful things, but then we eventually learn all of these awful things about the way society has been designed, and it basically crushes us. And I think it damages that part of the brain, because we see how damaging it is, and then it's very difficult to get back into recovering, being able to utilize that part of the brain in the same way we used to, because the point of the experience is to damage that and have other areas of the brain come online which are to do with learning, not earning progress goals and at the expense of the planet and other people. More about this brain learning thing. Learning increases blood flow to the brain. Maybe that's the amount of blood flow we're actually supposed to have in our brain, but we don't because we're not learning. And then the brain starts deteriorating. I actually feel like since Sandra Bond Chapman said that big ideas are very important for the brain, that maybe I can share some even weirder stuff as my brain goes there. I have weirder stuff written down in my notebooks probably, but I haven't even gotten there. And it's hard to go backwards because I write so much in current time. And again, it's not about the ideas, it's about if I would wish anything for somebody else, it would be to be restored to learning. Our brains are wanting to learn again, and we're told to fear our own brains. We're told that our brains are defective. And you can go on TED and listen to so many talks on neuroplasticity saying people who seem doomed with worse afflictions can get their brain functionality back. It's very plastic. So to think it can be damaged, to me, seems like a ridiculous notion. I feel like what's more important is to join with other brains and consciousness in order to have this flower into a different awareness, not an awareness of being some kind of defective person, but an awareness that the brain is trying to come back online. And is trying to learn. And it's trying to come back online so we cooperate together and we take care of each other. I feel like in each crisis, so-called crisis or episode, the brain is trying to learn how to take more perspectives. It's given me the experience of feeling like a homeless person. Maybe so I know what it feels like to be a homeless person. And it makes sense that it would do that in order for us to be able to empathize with each other and not judge each other and understand each other and help each other more. I feel like each episode of so-called psychosis is like the brain doing weightlifting. It's a hyper-learning state. Even if it's terrifying or even if it's magical, it's hyper-learning. It's new. It's something different than we're used to. So it's going to make the brain grow, not shrink. It's shrinking away from all that we used to think was important and meaningful. And that part of the brain goes offline somewhat. And then we're seen as mentally ill because we don't subscribe to the meanings of society that we've been given and tricked into thinking that are what matters in life. And then the double whammy is that we get tricked into thinking that we are defective. And everything outside of our regular mode of perception is slightly confusing. It's uncharted territory. And each episode helps us learn to navigate that confusion. And confusion is necessary for growth. If we're never confused, that could be a problem, because then we're just knowing everything all the time. And if we're only knowing, we're not open and curious. Being confused like that could actually provide a rich opportunity for learning. And it could be partly that we see that our thoughts are confusing. We confuse our thoughts with reality. And we're not only doing that in psychosis, we're doing that in regular consciousness. And those thoughts are telling us what is important and what is meaningful and what we want. But that's not in alignment with the universe. That's not in alignment with humanity. And so the universe comes in and tries to erase a lot of what we think is meaningful in life. And we often feel very connected with other meanings. And then when we come back to this meaningless reality, we're told that all of that just means we're mentally ill. When that's why I feel like harvesting one's mania, practicing and embodying is important. To do strength training, it's almost like we're given a blueprint in our brain, a blueprint of neurons for other territory and other meanings and other ways of being. And we can still recall those and go back there consciously without having to have the confusion. And I feel like that state is the mind. It's the collective mind, and it's showing us, it's trying to change our brain so we'll create a different world. A world that we all want. Even people who would pathologize us would want this other world. And we're here to create that world together. We're here to create a world where everybody lives in harmony, not where people kill each other. Does that seem like such an unreasonable thing to think? I think if somebody is never confused, if somebody never has a change in consciousness, then one isn't learning. One is more like a drone. So-called psychosis could be transconscious brain growth. When the brain goes up to different levels of consciousness, it grows. And it makes sense that the brain cells would get scared when it's coming back down to other levels of reality. I feel like the brain is having a growth spurt. And just like growth spurts physically can be painful, so can brain consciousness growth spurts. So I would like to put forth the idea of the brain growth theory of so-called psychosis. And it's like a form of sensory substitution. We're less sensing our ego structure that is a false structure that we've been given, that we've been conditioned with. And we're more sensing our sensitivity, we're more perceptive. And in the society we've designed, it's actually not good to be that perceptive. As we see, because people who go into that form of perception, I think it actually damages the prefrontal cortex, because one sees how damaging the prefrontal cortex is, in that what it has created for us collectively as humans isn't something we would design if we were in our right minds. And so a lot of it is recovery from society, and part of that is creating a new society. Who knows how to even go about that? But I think that people who go through transconsciousness would have a good idea of how to design a better society. And we might have to start with nothing, with no money. We don't have money anyway. We're defective according to society. But I feel like we could create a society that regular society would be wishing they could come and experience. And they talk about mental illness as having brain damage, and it gets worse over time. I think society is what damages the brain. So if it gets worse over time, it's that somebody that's hyper-perceptive is dipped in the poison of society, and over time they're seeing more and more traumatic things, and it is damaging their brains. And then the very paradigm designed to supposedly help just facilitates that process. The ego perspective gets damaged, but we are given infinite perspectives, and that isn't damaged. And it's not allowed to flower because we're actually not talking about all the perspectives that we've seen. We're not talking about our visions. We're not talking about our perception. We're not talking about our altruistic nature. People who pathologize us don't understand who we are in the heart. They're so busy looking at other things. They can't even see what we've seen. And then we come back here and we can't even tell people what we've seen. But at least if we can talk to each other, then maybe we'll create enough brain cells in each of our brains to protect us from pathologizing ourselves by taking somebody else's voice who's told us how to think about ourselves after all of that, and turning it into a label. Society is not designed for infinite learning. It's designed to be a drone, to be a robot. And recovery is about going back to just being a robot. I feel like map consciousness is perhaps a desperate attempt by the brain to restart itself, because all that one values in their ego process is false. And a lot of times that happens through trauma, and then the ego process falls apart, and then one has access to trans consciousness when the ego structure sees that what it's really valued has led it nowhere at all. And something happens where there's extra oxygen to the brain, and then the brain can learn. It's almost like the ego steals all the brain's oxygen. And I talked about in previous videos about how it wastes energy. And it could actually be that the prefrontal cortex is taking all the oxygen electrons, all the negative charge, into the prefrontal cortex, and the other areas of the brain can't grow. So when we no longer identify with that, then our brains can learn. And it's interesting that it feels spiritual, because learning feels spiritual. And in terms of learning, well, what do we need to learn? I think it goes back to things like cooperation. I don't know how. And I think map consciousness tries to recalibrate the brain and body to cooperate. Our brain is in service of our ego, and it's not listening to our body, and it's not listening to the fundamental laws of human nature either. And I have this sense that what we're looking for is actually our own brain, our own unclouded brain. But how do we look for that with a clouded brain? We're clouding the very thing we're looking for. We're clouding the very thing we're looking with. It's just clouded with a bunch of words. And I was thinking about medication and how it probably stops brain growth, probably stops oxygenation to the brain properly, and it stops people from thinking for themselves. And I feel like map consciousness is the brain or the mind trying to get the brain back interested in itself. Because if it doesn't become interested in itself and its own ability to learn, instead of just earning and pleasure in things, it's degrading. So map consciousness comes in and tries to make life interesting, tries to make it meaningful, tries to make it a different game. And all of a sudden, one is interested in learning because one finds every little thing interesting. And it's so powerful. Like, how could we not be so fascinated by that process? Even in retrospect after it stopped, but most of us aren't. We're like, wow, that was too scary. I'm just gonna drug myself and say don't stigmatize me and consider myself a less than person. And it's not about mental illness, it's about thought, old thoughts, habitual thoughts. And that's what degrades the brain. And then sometimes people get to the point where they have odd thoughts, but I think it's actually part of the process of getting out of the habit of thoughts that normally we are stuck in. And it's almost like the light of our vision has been turned into sound. So if a person has a quiet mind with no words in it, it's just silent, there's just light. And then whatever one sees can sort of speak to the person. But if we're speaking to ourselves, we're obstructing the light of our vision. And we can't really see. And so we've turned our light, we've turned our vision into sound that creates other images, that gets in the way. We're projecting. We're all living in a world of our own projection. And we're projecting our own voice. And we're being used by it, we're not using it. We've been taught to be used by our own voice instead of actually using it. And we're perhaps to use it to learn, not to judge and argue and actually solidify our separateness and solidify our positionalities and solidify our opinions. Most of our opinions we heard from somebody else. And then we translate it into our own voice and then we think it's our opinion. But it's actually just programming, and then we're turned into minions. I feel like I need to grow into my own brain blueprint. It's like I was given a blueprint when I went into map consciousness that very first time especially. And it grew some brain cells that if other people grew those brain cells, that would be the world. But people have these limited separate brains. The map consciousness gives us a map for learning. It's not about those specific experiences, it's about the learning process itself. It's an invitation to think for ourselves about things because that was our own inner experience. Nobody else had that experience exactly. People can't deny your inner experience. You could think about your inner experience however you want to. And according to that TED Talk, the bigger you think about things, the more oxygen you're going to have in your brain, the more blood you're going to have in your brain. And watch out, because you might actually get really smart. Part of the trouble actually is that people in regular consciousness with programmed brains don't really understand. So there's not very many people to talk to, because you may as well be talking to a brick wall. So that TED Talk really gave me the motivation to continue with self-dialogue and keep the oxygen going to my brain. So that could be the main point, to keep the extra oxygen going to my brain and keep my brain from shrinking back down to the level of society. The game of reality is dopamine, pleasure seeking, and the universe is erasing this program. So we need to find the new program and get with it, which could be learning, being creative, thinking for ourselves, and thinking together with each other and cooperating. Sounds like a more fun game.